we're very fortunate to have another expert from a slightly different tradition with us today to hold up the wisdom of the Eastern realms. I was thinking, Martin, maybe you could start us off with just getting a sense, maybe kind of contrasting a bit, if you like, with what Andrew's pointed out in some of the Western thought, or kind of going more essentially right into it. But what is the way that the Buddhist would come at this question of flourishing? How does the tradition approach it?
Well, I think the first of all, what's important to say, because there's many parallels with what Andrew presented in terms of Western philosophy, but the essence of the Buddhist tradition is that these beautiful qualities that might be held up, the most important thing is having ways to actually actualize these qualities. So Buddhist teachings are really, whatever the ideas involved, they're in the support of practices that actually bring alive these things. So if we're exploring the satisfaction of desires, for example, or the sense of virtue, the central question is, okay, well, how do I actually engage with life? How do I train my mind? How do I explore consciousness? How do I understand my activities in such a way that these can come alive? So there's many ways into that, but I thought one thing I could talk about is what's in the tradition called the three poisons and the three jewels. And so the three poisons are greed, hatred, and delusion. Right? So again, that can sound like, just sort of heavy-duty terms, but they're not about being moral concepts. They're about pointing to our immediate experience. Right? So when we're taken away from basic kind of ease, which we could call flourishing in this context, we're taken in one of those three directions. Greed, hatred, delusion means so greed, that condition of being pulled towards. And so we're kind of making demands on life. It's got to be like that. I want to have that. And so there's the being pulled into a kind of the condition of being in conflict with life because I need to have that for things to be okay. And then hatred, or opposite, that condition of pushing against, no, not that, that's not okay, I can't handle that, I don't want that, I've got to get away from that. And then delusion really being just the process of getting lost in various ways. So I tend to think of those three as what I call the three Ds, right? Demand, defense, and disconnect. And in that sense, they're very experiential. And so Buddhist practice often is about getting to know the ways I get demanding on life, or I get defensive against what's happening, or I just get lost in disconnection. And learning to become familiar with those so that one actually gets more fluid and free around them. So actually understand those mechanisms and how to dissolve them. And so there's a coming back and a coming back and a coming back out of those conditions of being caught in demand or defense or distraction. And there we get to actually sort of explore and open up the territory of being human, the territory of being conscious, which kind of the ground in which flourishing can happen. So that's that one side, the three poisons, and then the three jewels, which in the tradition, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. And so if I unpack those a little bit, Bud means awake. And so on the one hand, that's the principle that we can actually that we can know a condition of an awakened mind. We're actually really at home in and alive within our human condition. But it's not just the abstract or the ideal of that, it's also pointing to the fact that we're awake right now, like moment by moment. To the jewel of coming to what we're awake to, the very fact that we're conscious in the midst of what's happening to us. And that the fact of being awake here is actually more significant than what it is that we're awake to. There's all, our experience is constantly changing, but that orientation to a fundamental awakeness in the midst of experience. So that's the first jewel, Buddha. The second, Dhamma. Dhamma in some ways means practicing and teaching and having a path of practice, so that one's actually developing a human life rather than just kind of bouncing around within it more and less unconsciously. And then the most immediate sense of that, one way of translating Dharma, is the nature of things or the way things are. And so that orientation always, not just to how I think things could be or should be, but actually to be grounded in, centered in the way it actually is right now. And the way that gives some possibility to make an appropriate or wise or skillful response. Because I'm kind of involved in and anchored in the way it is rather than all the abstractions and pushes and pulls of the way I think it could or should be. And then the third one, Sangha. Sangha sort of means community, support. So on the one hand, it's orientated to the depth, the beauty, the value of being in the company of others with whom one shares values, aspirations, etc., etc. And you spoke about that a little this morning, just in terms of this gathering. And just in the few conversations I've had since I've been here, it's like, it's just very vivifying to be in the company of people with whom one can sense that quality of, shared interest, shared aspiration, and even if there are different views, a kind of shared willingness to go along together. So there's that, the value of community, especially if one's trying to cultivate something that even 2,500 years ago the Buddha called a path of going against the stream. Going against the stream of a lot of the values and directions and pushes and pulls of the culture around us. And then, again, there's the more immediate sense from the abstract to orientate moment by moment to that sense of support. The fact that we're not actually, it's not just me and my life, me and my life. We're always, what I call me and my life is always happening in the midst of the whole situation. Like earth below, earth below, sky above, air, sound, others. And to actually, again, it's not just thinking about that, but actually the orientation. So I kind of recognize that, like right now, voice, the sense of sitting here, the contact with all of you, it's like experience is arising out of and happening within a whole context, which actually, if we sense into that context, has no limit. We think about community as in us in terms of a group, but actually we're constantly in the community of all beings. We're in kinship with everything at all times, and to orientate to that, it's kind of relieves us of the burden of me having to do it all. So those three, awake in the midst of what's happening, Buddha, like actually grounded in the way it is rather than in all my ideas and interpretations of what's happening, and kind of like recognizing of the way this experience is emerging out of a limitless sense of wholeness. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Those three jewels are really the primary orientation to a fluid life, a free life, a flourishing life.
Thank you.
That was me trying to do the whistle-stop tour of the whole of 2,500 years of Buddhist thought.
Yeah. No. So can you say a little bit about, in a way, how you've arrived at this whistle-stop tour yourself? What's been your own process of flourishing, in terms of your own journey and how you've, in a way, learned to acquire these jewels?
Well, adolescent angst and confusion was definitely the beginning of all of that. Just sort of 17, 18, my friends were planning on going to university, and I remember looking through those things, and there just didn't seem to be anything in those university prospectuses about just the miracle of being alive. And I was so struck somehow as a teenager about, what is it to be conscious? What is it to be alive? What is it to be human? It seems so, genuinely perplexing and compelling to me, the fact that eyes work and hearing works, and there seems to be a central kind of registering of all that called consciousness, and what's that? And so I sort of got rather restless and confused about all of that, and long story short, sort of ran away to India to find out, with some idea that India was the land of all the mystical answers, and it turned out to be true. And so I just got a one-way ticket to Delhi when I was 19 and went with nothing, no luggage or anything, and got into meditation and stayed most of the next years in monasteries in Asia and with hermits in the mountains and things. And kind of discovered just a love of these things and the wonder that, there is this whole technology for just that, how to explore in a very, not in an abstract or intellectual way, but all these technologies for actually, coming inside and exploring consciousness from within. And so that any understanding of the world then is actually developed from the moment to moment deepening experience of it.
Andrew talked about the Platonic idea of the coexisting of the individual and the polis, and you just mentioned the sense of, when you talked about Sangha, that we're always already embedded in the world, and my own show is happening within this much larger context, and it's important to keep that in mind. Could you maybe, so for a moment, kind of leave the individual perspective and focus a little bit on what you see happening out there, what you see happening in culture and society today, with respect to flourishing? Where do you think we're going, if we're going anywhere at all? And yeah.
Well, one thing to point to is the fact that I think we're probably living in the most individualistic culture ever. If you look at the history of culture everywhere, it's mostly been communal, and the orientation then, when one's more embedded in community, is of a sense of one's responsibilities to the collective. And that seems to have gotten lost a lot. We're kind of encouraged a lot in a consumer culture, individualistic culture generally, to think, what am I getting? What can I get? What can I get? What can I get? And so that sense of we're constantly sort of taking in the world, consuming the world, swallowing the world. And so then it all seems to be about me. It's like, let the world come to me in that way. And throughout certainly in the East, but I think generally all the contemplative traditions, the stronger point is one about giving, like pouring oneself out into the world rather than trying to pour the world into me. And so that sense, like even a lot of ritual, a lot of religious practices, the sense of offering, whether it's offering a candle or offering incense or offering to a shrine, offering in the forms of giving to the poor, whatever it might be, just offering, the offering of oneself is really transformational to the way we experience our sense of each other. Offer it to each other brings us closer in a different kind of a way. And so even like some of you were at meditation this morning, if you just use the example of breath like we were doing in meditation, you can take your breath, take the breath, you can do breathing, and then it actually becomes quite quickly a bit tight and awkward. Or there can be that sense of, just the way the in-breath is offered. It's just offered. You don't have to do anything to breathe. The in-breath is offered. And then there's a sense of kind of wonder, of constantly being given this in-breath. And then letting one's out-breath be an offering. An offering. And there's some sense of, and in communities of practice that I've been a part of, when that sense of, rather than what can I get from this, what can I offer? What can I offer? When the more that's alive, the sense of what can I offer, and then if everybody's relating in that way, it's very natural then to receive offerings. And I think we both struggle to receive very often, and you can notice that just in the way people say thank you to you for something, and we sort of tend to deflect the apology, or we sort of want it. We want people to appreciate us and think how special we are. But if they actually tell us, I really appreciate you and you seem really special, kind of grab for it and then defend against it. And so actually the becoming more at ease, both with the sense of actually being able to offer, which gives us a sense of sufficiency, confidence, actually, rather than the neurotic or needy sense of having to get. So the sense of flourishing as a collective, born of a sense of offering and then receiving what's offered.
Yes, And I'm wondering, this gesture of offering seems quite hard to uphold when the world, in a way, comes and makes demands on us. In a way, life just announces itself on us. Like in say sickness or death, So those real moments of I think it's one of the retreats I went to. A teacher said, it's easy to be enlightened on a good day, And what about the times when life, just comes into our door and into our house and makes itself known? And actually, I remember the retreat I sat with you. I think it was towards the end of the retreat. You walked into the hall with a skull, and you proceeded to give this long lecture on death, and on why death was so freeing. I think from but correct me if I'm wrong in a moment. But there was this sense that actually we had to come home to our death, come home to our dying, in a very deep way if we wanted to be free. And I remember sitting there being like, well, that's fine for you, speak for yourself. But of course I sort of am fascinated by it, that sense, that very counterintuitive sense of in a way accepting the possibility of not being at all anymore, and how that actually has, I think, as you were expressing, these deep ramifications for flourishing. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, let's say we'll find out whether death is freeing or not, right? I think that's an important part of death reflection, is the recognition that whatever we speculate, we just don't know. We just don't know. But mostly it tends to be that we're quite defended against dying, or some people will say they're actively, afraid of dying. And the two positions tend to be, I'm either afraid of dying, or I'll say I'm not afraid, but I just, I keep pushing it out of awareness. And so within generally the contemplative traditions, but particularly within the Buddhist tradition, that sense of actually really bringing to mind regularly, like multiple times a day, the fact that all this is slipping away, and I don't know on what time scale. We just don't know the timing or the means of our death. And in contemporary culture, there can be the sense that reflecting on death is somehow morbid or depressing, but actually experientially, the very opposite is true. Even though at first we may feel confronted with the mysteriousness, the lack of control, the fear of death, the hanging on tightly to that which we cherish in life, etc. As we get more familiar, because we actually contemplate it, hence bringing the skull in, hence the little skull beads that I wear around my wrist, etc. So every time I stretch out my right hand, it's like, what am I doing? That's my destiny. That's where I'm heading for. Over time, as we become familiar with that, we find that, wow, there's nothing that fosters such a keen appreciation of the miracle that right now it's all working, And I don't know how long for. Nothing fosters such a keen appreciation of the preciousness of being alive today than the recognition that I might not be tomorrow. And so there's one part of that is just the kind of refreshing our appreciation for the aliveness that's here and not taking it for granted. And then that sense of, okay, so what makes sense for me? What actually is a useful way to respond to this day of aliveness, given that it really could be the last? And it also means that we find ourselves growing in a kind of deepening confidence. Even though we don't know, we'll only find out when death actually kind of, rears its head in front of us. But we find we start to taste a deepening confidence that actually when death comes, it'll be okay. And we have a sense that whenever it comes, whether it's today or tomorrow or in whatever circumstance, the deepening, growing, experiential confidence of the sense that at the moment of death, I'll actually be able to kind of bow and go out graciously. And there's something very compelling to me about that. And ironically, you quoted Dylan Thomas's line earlier, and one can explore that in different ways, and you were evoking that sense of, hey, life is precious, to rage against the dying of the light in various ways. But personally, I have no interest about enraging against the dying of that light. My wish is to kind of like when death arises, to be able to bow my head to it. And it seems to me the essence of living fully is also that deepening confidence that one will be able to die freely.
On that note, round of applause. Thank you so much, Martin Aylward.